When the 41st millennium drew to its blood-soaked close, long before the galaxy would be torn asunder by forces beyond mortal comprehension, the Imperium of Man stood as a crumbling monument to 10,000 years of stagnation and decay. The origins of what would become known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, remained shrouded in mystery even to the most learned tech adepts and inquisitorial scholars of our current age. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of cosmic forces that achieved mastery over reality itself, when the barriers between dimensions grew thin as parchment. In those final years of M41, the Imperium stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, yet for all its vast scope it had become a diseased giant stumbling toward an inevitable grave. Where once the Great Crusade had blazed trails of hope across the stars, now only the dying embers of ancient glories flickered in the darkness. The Emperor's vision of human dominion over the galaxy had curdled into a nightmare of endless bureaucracy, technological regression, and fanatical devotion to rituals whose original meanings had been lost to time. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon which had guided Imperial vessels through the warp for millennia, flickered with increasing irregularity. Its light, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, had begun to dim noticeably in the closing decades of M41. Navigators throughout the galaxy reported disturbing visions during warp travel, glimpses of impossible geometries, whispers in languages that predated human speech, and the growing sensation that something vast and malevolent was stirring in the deep currents of the immaterium. Archaeological evidence from the period reveals a civilization in terminal decline. Production quotas went unfulfilled as Forge worlds struggled with the loss of standard template construct knowledge. Entire sectors reported equipment failures that tech priests could no longer repair, lacking both the understanding and the resources to maintain technologies their ancestors had crafted with ease. The Imperium's military might, once capable of bringing entire alien civilizations to heel, increasingly relied on quantity over quality, fielding armies equipped with weapons that were crude copies of designs from the dark age of technology. Yet beneath this surface decay, forces far more ancient and terrible than imperial decline were stirring. The Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality, created by the birth of Slaanesh 10,000 years prior, had begun to expand with alarming regularity. What imperial scholars dismissed as natural fluctuation in warp current density was, in truth, the first symptom of a cosmic catastrophe that had been building since the dawn of human civilization. The few fragmentary records that survive from this period speak of disturbing phenomena occurring throughout the galaxy with increasing frequency. Daemon incursions, once rare enough to warrant inquisitorial investigation, became so common that many were handled by local planetary defense forces. Warp storms that should have lasted mere weeks persisted for years, cutting entire sectors off from imperial authority. Most ominously, psychers across the galaxy began reporting identical nightmares, visions of reality itself cracking like ice under tremendous pressure, with something dark and hungry pressing against the fissures from the other side. The state of the Imperium's defenses at this crucial juncture represented perhaps the greatest strategic vulnerability in human history. The Space Marine legions, broken apart after the Horus Heresy into smaller chapters to prevent future rebellions, were scattered across the galaxy fighting countless smaller conflicts. The Imperial Guard, that vast machine of human warfare, was bogged down in grinding campaigns that consumed entire generations of soldiers for minimal territorial gains. The Imperial Navy, once master of the void, struggled to maintain patrol routes through warp space that grew more treacherous with each passing year. On Cadia, the fortress world that stood sentinel at the edge of the Eye of Terror, the final preparations for humanity's greatest trial were already underway, though none could have recognized them as such. The mysterious pylons that dotted the planet's surface, ancient constructs of unknown origin that somehow stabilized local reality against warp intrusion, had begun emitting energy readings that exceeded all previously recorded parameters. Tech adepts dispatched to investigate reported findings that contradicted fundamental principles of imperial science, their reports buried in classified archives where they gathered dust alongside thousands of other inconvenient discoveries. The galaxy stood balanced on the edge of a knife, though precious few recognized the precipice that yawned beneath humanity's feet. In the grand palaces of Terra, the High Lords of the Imperium continued their endless political machinations, unaware that their empire was about to face a test that would make the Horus Heresy seem like a minor rebellion. In the depths of space, alien civilizations that had survived humanity's expansion by remaining hidden began to stir uneasily, ancient instincts warning them that the galaxy itself was about to change in ways that would affect every living being within it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the very nature of existence in the 41st millennium. Forces that had been building pressure for 10,000 years were about to find their release. And when they did, the galaxy would be torn apart by energies that reduced the mightiest Imperial warships to cosmic dust and transformed entire star systems into realms where the laws of physics held no meaning. What began as the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler would become something far greater and more terrible. The birth of the Great Rift. A wound in reality itself that would divide the galaxy and herald the beginning of humanity's darkest hour since the Age of Strife. The greatest fortress world in Imperial history would fall. Ancient technologies beyond human understanding would be unleashed, and the Emperor's realm would be split asunder by forces that even the architects of the catastrophe could not fully control. The cosmos held its breath, waiting for the moment when 10 millennia of accumulated tension would finally snap, and the grim darkness of the far future would reveal that it could become darker still. The warp in the closing centuries of M41 had become a roiling tempest of malevolent energy, far removed from the relatively stable Imperium that had allowed humanity's initial expansion among the stars. Where once the currents of psychic energy had flowed like rivers that skilled navigators could chart and follow, they now raged like hurricane winds, carrying with them the screams of tortured souls and the laughter of entities that delighted in mortal suffering. Imperial records from this period, fragmentary though they remain, paint a picture of a galaxy-wide psychic environment in terminal decay. Astropathic communications, the backbone of Imperial administration across vast interstellar distances, became increasingly unreliable. Messages that should have taken days to transmit across sectors now took months, if they arrived at all. When they did reach their destinations, they often carried disturbing alterations, words that had never been written, images that burned themselves into recipients' minds, and sometimes entire passages and languages that predated human civilization. The Navigator houses, those ancient bloodlines whose mutant gifts had guided humanity through the warp for millennia, reported unprecedented difficulties in their work. Where once their third eyes could penetrate the chaotic currents of the Imperium to find safe passage, they now spoke of visions that drove lesser navigators mad. Senior navigators of House Nostromo filed reports describing the warp as no longer hostile but actively hunting, while representatives of House Belisarius claimed that traditional navigation techniques were becoming useless as the currents themselves have developed malicious intent. Statistical analysis of Imperial shipping records reveals the true scope of the crisis. Warp travel incidents increased by 347% in the final century of M41 compared to the previous millennium. Geller field failures, once so rare that individual cases were studied for decades, became common enough that Imperial Navy vessels began carrying multiple backup generators as standard equipment. Most disturbing of all, ships began arriving at their destinations with no memory of their journey, their crews reporting that they had experienced normal warp transit while ship chronometers indicated voyages lasting decades longer than should have been possible. The environmental conditions of real space itself were deteriorating in ways that defied Imperial scientific understanding. On worlds throughout the galaxy, previously stable populations of psychers began manifesting at dramatically increased rates. Planets that had produced perhaps one sanctioned psycher per generation for centuries suddenly found themselves dealing with dozens of untrained individuals whose abilities exceeded anything in recorded Imperial history. The Black Ships, those grim vessels tasked with collecting psychers for the Emperor's service, found their holds overflowing with human cargo, their ancient schedules completely inadequate for the surge in psychic awakening. Tech priests monitoring atmospheric conditions on thousands of Imperial worlds detected anomalous energy readings that followed no known scientific principles. Electromagnetic fields fluctuated in patterns that seemed almost organic, while gravitational measurements suggested that the fundamental constants of physics were becoming inconsistent across different regions of space. On Forge worlds, machine spirits began exhibiting behaviors that ranged from the merely unusual to the actively hostile, with some ancient devices refusing to function while others operated beyond their design parameters with no external power source. The frequency of daemon incursions escalated beyond anything in recorded Imperial history. Segmentum Solar, the most heavily defended region of the galaxy, experienced 23% more confirmed daemon manifestations in the final decades of M41 than in the previous century combined. These were not the isolated incidents that Inquisitors had traditionally investigated, but coordinated attacks that suggested a level of planning and intelligence that challenged fundamental Imperial assumptions about the nature of chaos. More troubling still were the reports of impossible geometry appearing in Imperial architecture. Buildings that had stood unchanged for millennia began developing rooms that were larger inside than outside, corridors that led to destinations they could not possibly reach, and chambers where gravity operated according to rules that violated basic physics. These structural anomalies appeared first in the oldest Imperial installations, ancient fortress monasteries, forge world manufactorums that dated to the Great Crusade, and orbital stations that had been constructed using archaeotech, whose principles were no longer understood. The Astronomicon itself, that great beacon which had guided Imperial vessels for 10,000 years, began exhibiting signs of strain that terrified even the most senior Adeptus Astronomica officials. Its light, visible to navigators across half the galaxy, flickered with increasing frequency. Worse, during these periods of instability, navigators reported seeing other lights in the warp false beacons that seemed designed to lure ships off course into regions of space where no Imperial vessel had ever returned. Ancient monitoring stations throughout the galaxy detected seismic activity on dead worlds that had shown no geological movement for millions of years. Planets that had been rendered lifeless during the Age of Strife began emitting energy signatures that matched no known technology. Most disturbing of all, deep space observatories reported that certain stars were changing color in patterns that suggested artificial manipulation, though no known civilization possessed technology capable of such feats. On Cadia, the fortress world that stood as humanity's primary bulwark against the Eye of Terror, the mysterious pylons scattered across the planet's surface began exhibiting behavior that confounded tech adepts who had studied them for centuries. These ancient structures, whose origins remained unknown despite millennia of investigation, had always generated a low-level energy field that seemed to stabilize local reality against warp intrusion. Now, however, their energy output was increasing exponentially, creating readings that exceeded the measurement capabilities of Imperial equipment. The implications of these changes extended far beyond mere technical difficulties. Imperial Guard regiments stationed on worlds near major warp storms reported that their equipment was aging at accelerated rates, with weapons and vehicles that should have functioned for decades failing after mere months of service. Space Marine chapters found that their most ancient and revered artifacts, power armor worn by heroes of the heresy, weapons blessed by the Emperor himself, were developing flaws that no amount of maintenance could address. Perhaps most ominously, these environmental changes were affecting the very fabric of time itself. Imperial chronometers, synchronized across the galaxy through complex astrogational calculations, began showing discrepancies that grew larger with each passing year. Some worlds experienced days that lasted 30 standard hours, while others found their populations aging more slowly than normal. Temporal distortions created pockets of space where cause and effect operated according to alien logic, where Imperial forces might arrive at battlefields before the enemies they were meant to fight had even departed their home worlds. The cumulative effect of these changes was to create an environment where the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial civilization, that technology would function predictably, that space and time operated according to consistent rules, that the barrier between real space and the warp remained stable, were no longer valid. The galaxy was transforming into something alien and hostile, where humanity's 10,000-year mastery over the stars was revealed to be nothing more than a temporary exception to cosmic forces that had merely been biding their time. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler emerged from the Eye of Terror, not as a conventional military campaign, but as the culmination of 10 millennia of meticulous preparation and cosmic manipulation. Where previous Black Crusades had been massive but ultimately limited raids aimed at specific objectives, this final assault represented something fundamentally different, a coordinated attempt to transform the very nature of reality itself. Abaddon had learned harsh lessons from his previous 12 failures to bring the Imperium to its knees. Each crusade had been defeated not by superior Imperial forces, but by the fundamental limitations of operating from the Eye of Terror. Chaos armies, no matter how vast or powerful, could only maintain coherent military operations in real space for limited periods before the contradictions inherent in their nature caused them to turn upon themselves. Supply lines that depended on daemon-infested worlds were inherently unreliable, while communication across warp-torn space remained subject to the whims of entities whose motivations were alien to any coherent strategic doctrine. The War Master of Chaos had spent the centuries since his last defeat not merely gathering armies, but fundamentally restructuring the nature of chaos warfare itself. Through a combination of political manipulation, technological innovation, and pacts with powers that existed beyond the traditional pantheon of chaos gods, he had created something unprecedented in the history of the galaxy. A chaos force capable of sustained, coordinated operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. The first signs of this new approach became apparent to Imperial intelligence services in the months leading up to the Crusade's launch. Rather than the traditional pattern of massive fleet movements from the Eye of Terror, Imperial observers detected what appeared to be coordinated uprisings across dozens of star systems that had shown no previous signs of chaos corruption. Planetary governors who had served the Emperor faithfully for decades suddenly declared their world's independence from Imperial rule. Imperial Guard regiments with centuries of honorable service turned their weapons on their officers and began conducting complex military operations that suggested coordination from an external source. These simultaneous rebellions served multiple strategic purposes that only became clear in retrospect. By forcing the Imperium to deploy military assets to contain internal threats, Abaddon ensured that Imperial reinforcements would be scattered across the galaxy when his main assault commenced. More subtly, the rebellions created a network of chaos-controlled worlds that could serve as staging areas and supply bases, solving the logistical problems that had plagued previous Black Crusades. The technological innovations that Abaddon brought to bear represented perhaps his greatest strategic breakthrough. Through centuries of study and negotiation with the darkest entities in the warp, he had gained access to ancient technologies that predated humanity's rise to galactic dominance. The Blackstone fortresses, massive alien constructs that had been recovered and studied by Imperial forces for millennia, were revealed to be weapons of unimaginable destructive potential when properly understood and activated. These were not merely powerful warships, as Imperial analysts had assumed, but reality-manipulating devices capable of affecting the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Under Abaddon's control, they became tools for reshaping the galaxy according to the will of chaos, capable of creating permanent warp storms, destabilizing entire star systems, and most importantly, interfering with the ancient Pylon technology that kept certain regions of space stable against warp intrusion. The Planet Killer, Abaddon's flagship and personal weapon of terror, had been modified far beyond its already formidable capabilities. Where once it had been merely a ship capable of destroying worlds through brute force, it now incorporated technologies that allowed it to function as a focal point for reality-warping energies. Its approach through a star system would cause the local warp to become increasingly unstable, creating the conditions necessary for larger chaos forces to operate effectively in real space. The timing of the 13th Black Crusade's launch was not arbitrary, but carefully calculated to coincide with cosmic phenomena that occurred only rarely in galactic history. Ancient astronomical records, some dating back to the Dark Age of technology, indicated that certain alignments of stars and warp currents created windows of opportunity when the barriers between dimensions became particularly vulnerable. Abaddon had waited for just such an alignment, using the intervening centuries to position his forces for maximum impact when the moment arrived. The first Imperial forces to encounter the new Chaos Fleet formations reported engagements that defied everything they had been taught about Chaos military doctrine. Rather than the disorganized hordes driven by religious fervor that had characterized previous Black Crusades, they faced armies that fought with discipline and coordination that matched or exceeded Imperial standards. Chaos Space Marines operated in perfect synchronization with Daemon hordes, while Traitor Guard regiments provided supporting fire with a precision that suggested unified command and control structures. More disturbing still were reports that Chaos forces were employing tactics that seemed designed not merely to defeat Imperial armies, but to fundamentally alter the nature of the battlefields themselves. Areas where major engagements occurred began exhibiting the same reality distortions that had previously been confined to regions near major warp storms. Time flowed differently. gravity operated according to alien principles, and the basic laws of physics became negotiable rather than absolute. Imperial intelligence services, already strained by the need to monitor simultaneous uprisings across multiple sectors, found themselves completely unable to predict chaos movements using traditional analytical methods. Chaos fleets appeared to move faster than should have been possible, arriving at target systems before Imperial reinforcements could be deployed. In some cases, Chaos forces seemed to be attacking Imperial positions before they had actually departed their staging areas, suggesting either unprecedented coordination or manipulation of time itself. The expansion of Chaos influence followed patterns that revealed the true scope of Abaddon's strategic vision. Rather than focusing on traditional military objectives like forge worlds or sector capitals, Chaos forces targeted locations that seemed to have little strategic value but possessed ancient significance. Worlds that contained pre-Imperial archaeological sites, star systems with unusual gravitational anomalies, and regions of space where reality had always been slightly unstable became primary objectives. This seemingly irrational target selection began to make sense only when Imperial analysts realized that Abaddon was not attempting to conquer the galaxy in any traditional sense, but to transform it. Each captured world became a focal point for reality distortion, a location where the laws of physics could be rewritten according to the will of chaos. The cumulative effect of these transformations was to create a network of instability that extended far beyond the immediate areas of chaos control. The recognition of this strategy's true nature came too late for effective Imperial countermeasures. By the time Imperial High Command understood that they were facing not a military invasion, but an attempt at cosmic transformation, Chaos forces had already established the foundation for changes that would affect the entire galaxy. The 13th Black Crusade had evolved beyond mere warfare into something approaching terraforming on a galactic scale, with humanity's enemies seeking not just to defeat the Imperium, but to remake reality itself according to principles that were fundamentally hostile to human existence. The emergence of this new form of chaos warfare represented a paradigm shift that rendered 10,000 years of Imperial military doctrine obsolete. The enemy was no longer content to raid Imperial territory or capture specific objectives, but sought nothing less than the fundamental transformation of the galaxy into a realm where chaos reigned supreme and the very concept of physical law became subject to the whims of entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The documentary evidence of chaos capabilities during the early phases of the 13th Black Crusade revealed military power that exceeded even the most pessimistic Imperial projections by several orders of magnitude. Naval engagement records from the period, those few that survived the systematic destruction of Imperial archives, describe confrontations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The first major fleet engagement occurred in the Exsurgia system, where Admiral Quarren's Third Battle Fleet encountered what appeared to be a standard Chaos raiding force. Initial tactical assessments suggested the Imperial force held significant advantages in both numbers and firepower. The engagement began according to established naval doctrine, with Imperial vessels maintaining formation while unleashing coordinated broadsides against the approaching Chaos fleet. What followed defied every principle of void warfare that Imperial commanders had learned over centuries of experience. The Chaos vessels, rather than responding with conventional weaponry, began generating energy fields that caused reality itself to behave according to alien principles. Imperial macro cannons fired shells that transformed into living creatures mid-flight, while lance batteries produced beams of light that burned with cold fire and froze whatever they touched. Most disturbing of all, some Imperial ships found their own weapons turning against them, as machine spirits corrupted by proximity to chaos influence began targeting their own fleet. The Blackstone fortresses proved to be the most devastating revelation of chaos technological superiority. These massive constructs, which Imperial forces had encountered in previous campaigns and dismissed as particularly large warships, demonstrated capabilities that rendered traditional naval tactics meaningless. When the first Blackstone fortress engaged Imperial battle group Cadia at the edge of the system's gravity well, its initial salvo did not destroy the opposing ships but simply removed them from existence. Tech adept Valerius Magna, one of the few survivors of that engagement, transmitted a final data burst before his ship was consumed by energies that his instruments could not classify. His report described weapons that do not destroy matter, but convince reality, that the target never existed. Imperial vessels simply vanished from scanner readings without debris, without energy signatures, without any evidence that they had ever been present at that location in space. The daemon manifestations that accompanied Chaos Fleet operations exceeded anything in recorded Imperial history, both in scale and in the sophistication of their coordination with conventional military forces. Where previous Chaos incursions had featured daemons appearing randomly on Imperial vessels, the 13th Black Crusade employed daemon boarding parties that materialized with tactical precision at critical ship systems. Engine rooms, command bridges, and Geller field generators became primary targets for entities that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Imperial ship design. These daemon forces operated according to military doctrine that suggested central planning and coordination impossible under normal warp conditions. Greater daemons served as field commanders for lesser entities, while daemon princes provided strategic oversight that allowed Chaos forces to adapt their tactics in real time to Imperial countermeasures. The traditional Imperial response of sealing compromised ship sections became ineffective when daemons could simply dissolve bulkheads through force of will or step through solid matter as if it were empty space. The return of the daemon primarchs to real space represented perhaps the most shocking manifestation of Chaos power during this period. Magnus the Red's appearance in the Fenris system came without warning, his psychic presence alone causing reality distortions across multiple worlds. Space Wolf forces, veterans of 1,000 campaigns against Chaos, found themselves facing an enemy who could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics through pure force of will. Eyewitness accounts from the Battle of the Fang describe Magnus manifesting simultaneously at multiple locations across Fenris, each appearance real rather than illusory. He commanded Thousand Sons legions that included warriors who had died during the Horus Heresy, their forms reconstructed from crystallized warp energy and the memories of their fallen brothers. These Revenant Astartes fought with skills and knowledge accumulated over 10 millennia of existence in the warp, their tactical abilities enhanced by direct communication with their Primarch across impossible distances. Mortarian's plague fleets demonstrated that the Death Guard had evolved far beyond their already formidable capabilities during their time in the warp. Their ships spread diseases that affected not just living beings but inanimate matter, causing Imperial vessels to develop organic growths that interfered with critical systems. Entire star systems found their atmospheres becoming toxic to human life as Mortarian's presence caused fundamental changes in atmospheric chemistry that rendered worlds uninhabitable within days of his arrival. The time distortions that accompanied major Chaos operations created tactical situations that Imperial commanders had no framework for understanding. Chaos forces began arriving at battle sites before Imperial forces had received orders to deploy, suggesting either unprecedented intelligence capabilities or manipulation of temporal mechanics. In some engagements, Imperial forces found themselves fighting the same battle multiple times, with their enemies demonstrating knowledge of tactics that the Imperial commanders had not yet decided to employ. Captain Darnath Lysander of the Imperial Fists filed reports describing engagements where Chaos forces responded to Imperial battle plans before they had been communicated to frontline units. His company found itself under fire from positions that should have been impossible to establish, facing enemies who seemed to know exactly where Imperial forces would attempt to advance. When questioned by inquisitorial investigators, Lysander could only report that the enemy fights as if they have already won, and are merely playing out a victory they remember from our future. The coordination between different Chaos factions reached levels that violated everything Imperial scholars understood about the nature of Chaos itself. Traditional theological doctrine held that the competing nature of the Chaos gods made sustained cooperation impossible, as their fundamental opposition to each other would eventually cause any alliance to collapse into internal warfare. The 13th Black Crusade demonstrated that this assumption was catastrophically incorrect. Khornate berserkers fought alongside Nurgle plague marines with perfect tactical coordination, while Slaneshi cultists provided intelligence support for Tenchian sorcerers conducting reality-warping rituals. This cooperation extended beyond mere battlefield tactics to encompass strategic planning on a galactic scale. Different Chaos factions simultaneously attacked Imperial positions thousands of light-years apart, their operations timed to achieve maximum cumulative effect rather than individual glory. Imperial tarot readings during this period consistently produced results that defied interpretation. Cards that had maintained consistent meanings for millennia began shifting their significance mid-reading, while some spreads produced images that had never been seen before in 10,000 years of Imperial divination. Sanctioned psychers reported that their attempts to scry chaos intentions resulted in visions that changed depending on who was observing them, suggesting that chaos forces had developed countermeasures against Imperial psychic reconnaissance. The industrial capacity that chaos forces brought to bear revealed long-term preparation that spanned centuries if not millennia. Chaos fleets fielded vessels that incorporated technologies from dozens of different civilizations, creating hybrid warships that combined the strengths of multiple design philosophies while mitigating their individual weaknesses. These ships were not hastily converted Imperial vessels or crude chaos constructions, but purpose-built warships designed specifically for the unique challenges of reality-warping combat. The psychological impact on Imperial forces proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Veterans of campaigns against orcs, tyrannids, and other alien threats found themselves facing enemies that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the universe operated. Morale collapsed not just because of military defeats, but because Imperial soldiers could no longer trust their own perceptions of reality. Equipment that had functioned reliably for centuries began operating according to principles that defied comprehension, while familiar Imperial symbols began manifesting properties that their creators had never intended. The cumulative effect of these manifestations was to reveal that the 13th Black Crusade represented not just military superiority, but a fundamental evolution in the nature of chaos itself. Where previous chaos incursions had been limited by the inherent instability of warp-spawned forces, Abaddon had somehow achieved the impossible. He had created order within chaos while retaining all of chaos's reality-warping advantages. The enemy that Imperial forces faced was no longer the disorganized horde driven by religious fervor that Imperial doctrine had prepared them to fight, but a coordinated military force that could reshape the battlefield itself according to its strategic requirements. Cadia stood at the height of its power as the 41st millennium drew to a close, representing perhaps the greatest achievement of Imperial military engineering and strategic planning in the 10,000 years since the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne. The fortress world had evolved far beyond its original purpose as a simple garrison planet into something approaching a perfect military installation, where every aspect of the world's geography, infrastructure, and population had been optimized for the singular purpose of holding the line against the forces of chaos. The planet's defensive capabilities at this pinnacle moment were staggering in their scope and sophistication. The entire surface of Cadia had been transformed into an interconnected network of fortifications that made traditional concepts of siege warfare obsolete. Every mountain peak hosted a fortress. Every valley contained bunker complexes that could house entire regiments, and every major river had been channeled through defensive positions that could be flooded with promethium and ignited to create impassable barriers of flame. The Cadian Khazars, those massive fortress cities that dotted the planet's surface, represented the pinnacle of Imperial defensive architecture. Each Khazar was designed to function as an independent military installation, capable of sustaining siege conditions for decades without external support. Their walls, constructed from ferrocrete reinforced with adamantium and blessed by millennia of prayer, stood hundreds of meters tall and incorporated weapon systems that could engage targets in orbit. The largest of these installations, Khazar Tyrok, housed a population of over 50 million and maintained industrial facilities capable of producing everything from lasgun power packs to Baneblade super heavy tanks. The military doctrine that had evolved on Cadia over 10 millennia of constant warfare represented the distillation of humanity's accumulated knowledge of defensive combat. The Cadian shock troops, trained from childhood in the arts of war, had developed tactics and strategies that maximized the advantages of fighting on prepared ground, while minimizing the chaos and unpredictability that characterized most Imperial military operations. Every Cadian soldier could function as an engineer, a medic, and a communications specialist in addition to their primary role as infantry, creating military units with unprecedented versatility and resilience. The legendary effectiveness of Cadian military doctrine extended far beyond the planet itself. Cadian officers served as advisors and commanders throughout the Imperial Guard, while entire regiments modeled themselves on Cadian training methods and organizational structures. The phrase Cadian standard had become synonymous with military excellence across the Imperium, with Forge Worlds producing equipment specifically designed to meet Cadian specifications, and Imperial military academies studying Cadian battle tactics as examples of perfect execution. The mysterious pylons scattered across Cadia's surface represented perhaps the most crucial element of the planet's defensive capabilities, though their true nature remained enigmatic even to the tech adepts who had studied them for centuries. These ancient structures, clearly predating human colonization of the world, generated energy fields that somehow stabilized local reality against warp intrusion. Their presence allowed Cadia to exist in relative stability despite its proximity to the Eye of Terror, creating a bubble of normal space-time in a region where such stability should have been impossible. Archaeological evidence suggested that the pylons were far older than human civilization itself, their construction techniques and materials unlike anything in Imperial archives. They incorporated elements that registered as neither purely technological nor entirely psychic in nature, instead representing some hybrid approach to manipulating reality that combined physical engineering with metaphysical principles. Tech-adept investigators had documented over 3,000 different types of energy emissions from the pylons, creating readings that filled entire data vaults without yielding any clear understanding of their operational methods. The organizational structure that coordinated Cadia's defense represented a masterpiece of Imperial administration and military hierarchy. The planet's command structure successfully integrated multiple branches of Imperial service into a unified command that could respond to threats ranging from individual daemon incursions to sector-wide chaos invasions. The Cadian High Command maintained direct communication links with Terra, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Space Marine chapters, and the Imperial Navy, creating a coordination network that allowed for unprecedented strategic flexibility. The planet's strategic importance extended far beyond its role as a simple fortress world. Cadia controlled the most stable warp route between the Eye of Terror and the rest of Imperial space, making it effectively the gatekeeper for the entire Segmentum Obscurus. This position allowed Imperial forces to monitor chaos movements and respond to threats before they could spread throughout the galaxy. The intelligence network centered on Cadia provided early warning of chaos activities across dozens of star systems, while the planet's communications facilities served as relay points for Imperial messages throughout the troubled region. The technological marvels incorporated into Cadia's defensive systems represented some of the most advanced Imperial engineering achievements of the late 41st millennium. Void shield generators protected entire continents from orbital bombardment, while ground-to-orbit weapons platforms could engage hostile fleets while they were still days away from planetary orbit. The planet's industrial capacity rivaled that of minor forge worlds, with manufacturing facilities capable of producing specialized equipment and ammunition types that were unavailable anywhere else in the Imperium. The cultural achievements of Cadian society at its peak demonstrated that military excellence could coexist with sophisticated civilization. Despite the planet's reputation as a fortress world, Cadian artists, scholars, and engineers made significant contributions to Imperial culture and technology. The Cadian military academies produced not just officers but administrators, diplomats, and technical specialists who served throughout the Imperium. Cadian literature and art, while focused on military themes, achieved levels of sophistication that earned recognition even on Terra itself. However, beneath this impressive facade of military perfection lay subtle vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when finally exploited. The pylons, for all their protective capabilities, depended on ancient technologies that no living human truly understood. Imperial tech adepts could maintain and repair the structures, but their fundamental operating principles remained mysterious. This lack of understanding meant that when the pylons began operating beyond their normal parameters, Imperial forces had no framework for predicting or controlling their behavior. The over-reliance on Cadian military doctrine across multiple star systems created strategic inflexibility that Chaos forces would eventually learn to exploit. While Cadian tactics were undeniably effective against conventional threats, they had been developed through centuries of fighting enemies that operated according to recognizable military principles. When faced with opponents who could reshape reality itself, traditional Cadian approaches to warfare proved inadequate. Archaeological investigations conducted in the final decades of M41 had uncovered disturbing evidence about the true nature of Cadia's ancient past. Deep excavations revealed structures that predated the pylons themselves, suggesting that the world had been artificially modified multiple times by different civilizations. Some of these discoveries indicated that Cadia's strategic position was not coincidental but had been deliberately engineered to serve purposes that went far beyond simple defense against chaos. The assumption that past victories guaranteed future success had become deeply embedded in Cadian strategic thinking. The successful repulsion of 12 previous Black Crusades had created a sense of invincibility that made it difficult for Imperial commanders to imagine scenarios where Cadia itself might be truly threatened. This psychological factor would prove as dangerous as any physical vulnerability when the planet faced enemies who had learned from previous defeats and developed entirely new approaches to warfare. Subtle signs that the Pylons were not functioning at full capacity had been dismissed by Imperial authorities as normal operational variations. Energy readings that exceeded historical norms were attributed to natural fluctuations in warp current density, while unusual resonance patterns were explained as the result of age-related changes in the structure's crystalline matrices. These dismissals prevented Imperial forces from recognizing that the Pylons were already being affected by changes in the galactic environment that would soon make their continued operation impossible. The Golden Age of Cadian power represented humanity's greatest achievement in the realm of defensive warfare, but it also embodied the fundamental limitations of Imperial strategic thinking. By creating what appeared to be an impregnable fortress, Imperial planners had convinced themselves that they had solved the problem of chaos permanently. The reality was that they had merely created a more valuable target for enemies who had spent millennia learning how to turn Imperial strengths into weaknesses. Cadia's very perfection as a fortress world made it the ideal location for demonstrating that no Imperial achievement, no matter how impressive, could withstand the full attention of powers that existed beyond the physical universe itself. The strategic doctrine behind Abaddon's multi-vector assault represented a fundamental evolution in chaos military philosophy, moving beyond the traditional approach of concentrated force applied to single objectives toward a sophisticated campaign of simultaneous pressure applied across multiple fronts. This new methodology sought not merely to overwhelm Imperial defenses through superior numbers, but to systematically undermine the foundational assumptions upon which Imperial military doctrine had been built over 10 millennia of warfare. The coordination of chaos forces across vast interstellar distances during the 13th Black Crusade violated everything Imperial strategists understood about the limitations of warp-based communication and command structures. Traditional chaos operations had been characterized by their inability to maintain coherent strategic planning beyond individual star systems, as the chaotic nature of warp travel made reliable coordination impossible. Abaddon had somehow solved this fundamental problem, creating command and control networks that allowed chaos forces separated by thousands of light-years to operate as components of a unified military machine. The evidence for this unprecedented coordination emerged from pattern analysis conducted by Adeptus Mechanicus cogitators processing battle reports from across the galaxy. Imperial forces fighting seemingly independent chaos incursions began reporting tactical similarities that suggested central planning and shared intelligence. Enemy units employed identical battlefield innovations, responded to Imperial countermeasures using the same adapted tactics, and demonstrated knowledge of Imperial deployments that should have been impossible to obtain through normal reconnaissance methods. Different Chaos God factions worked together with a harmony that contradicted fundamental theological principles about the nature of chaos itself. Coordinate assault forces provided close combat support for Tsenchian sorcerers conducting reality-warping rituals, while Nurgle Plague Marines established defensive positions that allowed Slaaneshi cultists to conduct their own specialized operations without interference. This cooperation extended beyond mere battlefield expedience to encompass strategic planning that maximized the unique capabilities of each Chaos faction while mitigating their traditional weaknesses. The spreading influence of warp corruption on previously secure Imperial worlds followed patterns that revealed sophisticated understanding of Imperial psychology and social structures. Rather than the random manifestation of chaos influence that had characterized previous incursions, the 13th Black Crusade featured targeted corruption campaigns designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Imperial society. Chaos cultists emerged simultaneously across multiple worlds, suggesting coordination that spanned decades if not centuries of preparation. Industrial worlds found their production capabilities turned against Imperial forces as worker populations embraced chaos philosophies that promised liberation from the grinding monotony of Imperial servitude. Hive worlds experienced coordinated uprisings that began in the deepest underhive levels and spread upward through carefully planned stages, each phase timed to overwhelm Imperial security forces while they were still responding to previous threats. Agricultural worlds saw their food production systems corrupted, creating famine conditions that weakened Imperial resolve while strengthening Chaos influence through desperation and suffering. The Imperial responses varied dramatically between different branches of the military hierarchy, revealing coordination problems that Chaos forces exploited with ruthless efficiency. The Imperial Navy, focused on void warfare and orbital supremacy, struggled to adapt to ground-based threats that could not be addressed through conventional bombardment. Space Marine chapters trained for rapid deployment and decisive action found themselves fighting prolonged campaigns that demanded resources and patience their organizational structures were not designed to provide. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to analyze Chaos tactical innovations using logical frameworks that proved inadequate for understanding enemies who operated according to principles that transcended rational analysis. Their attempts to predict Chaos movements through statistical modeling and pattern recognition consistently failed because Chaos forces could alter their own behavioral patterns through reality manipulation, making past performance irrelevant as a predictor of future actions. Lord Commander Solar Macharius initiated the largest military mobilization in Imperial history since the Horus Heresy, deploying entire sector fleets to combat zones across multiple segmentums simultaneously. However, these massive redeployments created new vulnerabilities that Chaos forces had anticipated and prepared to exploit. Imperial worlds stripped of their garrison forces found themselves facing internal uprisings that had been dormant for decades, while strategic reserve formations discovered that their intended deployment routes had become impassable due to warp storm activity. The Inquisition deployed Grey Knights on an unprecedented scale, authorizing the use of these elite daemon hunting forces for operations that would normally have been handled by conventional Imperial Guard regiments. However, even these specialized anti-chaos units found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of simultaneous daemon manifestations across the galaxy. Traditional inquisitorial doctrine called for careful investigation and precise surgical strikes against chaos influence. But the 13th Black Crusade created conditions where such methodical approaches were simply inadequate. Reality storms began appearing in star systems that had never experienced significant warp disturbances, making Imperial reinforcement impossible across vast regions of space. These phenomena were not random warp fluctuations, but carefully orchestrated disruptions designed to isolate Imperial forces and prevent coordinated response to chaos advances. Imperial fleets found themselves trapped in systems where normal space operated according to alien principles, while communication networks designed to function across galactic distances became unreliable within individual sectors. Corruption began spreading through Vox transmissions and data streams, turning Imperial communication networks into vectors for chaos influence. Standard Imperial military communications protocols, developed over millennia to prevent information security breaches, proved inadequate against corruption that operated on metaphysical rather than technological principles. Imperial officers found themselves receiving orders that appeared authentic but contained subtle alterations designed to create confusion and misdirection. The psychological impact on Imperial forces exceeded the physical damage caused by chaos military operations. Imperial soldiers who had trained for decades to fight alien threats found themselves facing enemies that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality itself. Equipment that had functioned reliably throughout countless campaigns began operating according to principles that defied technical understanding, while familiar Imperial symbols began manifesting properties that their creators had never intended. Ancient technology throughout the galaxy began malfunctioning in specific patterns that suggested coordinated interference rather than random system failures. Machine spirits that had served Imperial forces faithfully for millennia began exhibiting hostile behavior, while automated defense systems turned their weapons against the Imperial forces they were designed to protect. These technological failures followed geographical patterns that correlated with areas of heavy chaos activity, suggesting that chaos influence could affect Imperial equipment across interstellar distances. Reports began reaching Imperial High Command of dead Imperial heroes returning as servants of chaos, their knowledge of Imperial tactics and strategies intact despite their corruption. These revenant commanders led chaos forces with intimate understanding of Imperial military doctrine, turning Imperial strengths against themselves through tactical innovations that exploited decades of battlefield experience. The psychological impact of facing familiar faces in enemy ranks proved as devastating to Imperial morale as any conventional military defeat. Civilian populations began experiencing mass evacuations from threatened sectors, creating refugee crises that strained Imperial resources and created new opportunities for chaos infiltration. Traditional Imperial policy called for defending worlds in place rather than abandoning them to enemy forces. But the scale of the 13th Black Crusade made such defensive strategies unsustainable. The sight of Imperial forces retreating from worlds they had defended for centuries created panic that spread faster than Chaos armies themselves. The cumulative effect of these simultaneous pressures was to reveal that the Imperium's apparent strength had been built upon assumptions that were no longer valid. Imperial military doctrine had been developed to fight enemies that operated according to recognizable principles of warfare. But Chaos forces had evolved beyond such limitations. The enemy that Imperial forces now faced could reshape the battlefield itself, making traditional concepts of strategic advantage meaningless and forcing Imperial commanders to fight a war for which no amount of preparation could have been adequate. The Pylons scattered across Cadia's surface began exhibiting anomalous behavior in the months preceding Abaddon's final assault, generating readings that confounded tech adepts who had devoted centuries to studying these mysterious structures. Where the ancient constructs had previously maintained steady energy output patterns that varied only slightly with seasonal and astronomical cycles, they now produced fluctuations that exceeded all previously recorded parameters and followed no discernible pattern that Imperial science could explain. Tech Adept Dominus Halvax Korin, senior researcher at the Cadian Institute of Xenoarchaeological Studies, filed increasingly urgent reports describing energy signatures that violated fundamental principles of Imperial physics. The Pylons' crystalline matrices, which had remained stable for millennia, began resonating at frequencies that caused sympathetic vibrations in unrelated technologies across the planet. Imperial communications equipment experienced interference patterns that matched no known source, while power generation facilities registered drain fluctuations that suggested the Pylons were drawing energy from sources that did not appear on any scanner readings. The Cadian shock troops, renowned throughout the galaxy for their equipment reliability and maintenance expertise, began reporting weapon malfunctions that followed no logical patterns. Las guns that had functioned flawlessly for decades suddenly developed power regulation problems that caused them to fire at random intervals. Vox casters began picking up transmissions in languages that linguistic specialists could not identify, while Auspex units displayed readings that indicated the presence of massive objects in locations where visual observation confirmed empty space. More disturbing were the reports from veteran sergeants who discovered their unit's equipment aging at accelerated rates in specific geographical locations. Areas within a certain distance of the largest pylons experienced equipment degradation that exceeded normal wear patterns by factors of 10 or more. Flak armor developed stress fractures overnight, while vehicles required constant maintenance to prevent critical system failures that should not have occurred for years under normal operating conditions. Chronometer synchronization, a routine procedure that had been performed without incident for centuries, began producing results that made no sense according to Imperial understanding of temporal mechanics. Different chronometers within the same facility would show time progressing at different rates, with variations that grew larger as proximity to pylon installations increased. Guard regiments conducting routine patrol rotations found themselves completing circuits that should have taken 6 hours in either 4 hours or 8 hours, depending on their route relative to pylon locations. Deep beneath Cadia's surface, seismic monitoring stations detected energy patterns that seemed to originate from geological formations that should have been tectonically inert. The planet's crust showed signs of activity that contradicted centuries of geological surveys, with subsurface movements that followed the same geometric patterns as the pylon placement above ground. Mining operations that had extracted resources from specific locations for decades suddenly encountered chambers that had not been present during previous excavations. Tech adepts attempting to explain these phenomena found their analytical frameworks inadequate for understanding energy sources that appeared to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Standard Imperial scientific methods required observable cause and effect relationships, but the pylon anomalies seemed to involve causality loops where effects preceded their apparent causes. Equipment designed to measure temporal distortions registered readings that indicated time was flowing backward in localized areas around the ancient structures. The machine spirits inhabiting Cadia's most ancient and revered equipment began exhibiting behaviors that suggested awareness of impending changes. Servitors with centuries of reliable service started performing tasks they had not been programmed to execute, while vehicle machine spirits began refusing certain commands that their operators had given thousands of times before. These behavioral changes appeared random at first, but pattern analysis revealed that the affected equipment was consistently avoiding activities that would place it in proximity to areas where pylon energy readings were strongest. Imperial Guard units stationed near pylon installations reported a dramatic increase in equipment failures during routine maintenance procedures. Components that had been designed to last for decades required replacement after mere weeks of service, while backup systems activated without apparent cause. Most disturbing were the reports of equipment that appeared to be aging selectively, with some components showing extreme wear while others in the same device remained in perfect condition. Vox communications between different Cadian installations began carrying anomalous data that appeared as background static, but contained information that had never been transmitted. Communications specialists attempting to isolate and analyze these signals discovered that they contained tactical information about Imperial troop movements that was accurate but had been classified at levels above their security clearance. The source of this information remained unidentifiable despite intensive investigation by Cadian intelligence services. The Cadian military academies, responsible for training officers who would serve throughout the galaxy, began reporting problems with their most fundamental educational equipment. Tactical simulation systems that had operated flawlessly for centuries started producing scenarios that incorporated variables not included in their programming. These scenarios consistently featured tactical situations that matched conditions Imperial forces were facing in real combat zones, despite the simulation systems having no access to current intelligence reports. Astrological observations conducted from Cadia's surface revealed distortions in stellar positions that could not be explained by normal gravitational effects or equipment malformation. Stars that had occupied fixed positions relative to Cadia for millennia appeared to be moving in patterns that suggested the planet itself was shifting position within its solar system. However, orbital calculations confirmed that Cadia remained in its proper position relative to its star, indicating that the observed stellar movements were either illusions or evidence of space-time distortion on a system-wide scale. The atmospheric processors that maintain Cadia's breathable environment began producing readings that indicated the presence of trace gases that were not present in the facility's input systems. These unknown compounds appeared in concentrations that suggested they were being generated within the processing equipment itself, despite the impossibility of such generation according to established chemical principles. Analysis of these compounds revealed molecular structures that incorporated elements not found on the periodic table of known substances. Imperial astropaths stationed on Cadia reported increasing difficulty maintaining psychic communication with other worlds, describing interference patterns that seemed to anticipate and counter their transmission attempts. The interference was not random psychic static, but appeared to be intelligently designed countermeasures that adapted to different communication techniques in real time. More disturbing was the discovery that some intercepted Imperial messages had been altered during transmission, with changes that improved the tactical value of the information being communicated. Archaeological excavations near Pylon sites began uncovering artifacts that had not been present during previous surveys of the same locations. These objects appeared to be of human manufacture but incorporated design elements that did not match any known Imperial or pre-Imperial technological traditions. Carbon dating of these artifacts produced results that indicated ages both far older and far younger than should have been possible, suggesting that normal temporal relationships were breaking down in areas of high pylon activity. The cumulative effect of these anomalies was to create an environment where Imperial forces could no longer trust their most basic assumptions about how technology should function. Equipment that had operated according to predictable principles for millennia began behaving according to rules that seemed to change without notice. The realization that these problems were not random malfunctions but followed patterns connected to pylon activity suggested that Cadia's ancient defensive systems were either failing catastrophically or beginning to operate according to purposes that their current users did not understand. Investigation into the true nature of these anomalies revealed evidence that the pylons were not simply defensive installations, but components of a larger system whose complete purpose had never been fully understood by Imperial authorities. The patterns of malfunction and behavioral change suggested that the pylons were activating capabilities that had remained dormant for millennia, responding to cosmic conditions that were fundamentally different from anything in recorded Imperial history. The ancient structures that had protected Cadia from chaos influence for 10,000 years were becoming something else entirely, and that transformation was beginning to affect every aspect of life on humanity's most important fortress world. The approach of Abaddon's planet killer through the Cadian Gate system marked the beginning of a new phase of warfare that transcended conventional military conflict and entered the realm of cosmic catastrophe. The massive vessel, its bulk exceeding that of entire Imperial battle fleets, moved through space accompanied by reality distortions that preceded its physical presence by days, creating zones where the fundamental laws of physics operated according to principles that defied Imperial understanding. Admiral Corrin's reconnaissance squadrons, positioned at the outer edge of the Cadian system, transmitted their final reports as wave after wave of scanner readings revealed the true scope of the approaching threat. The planet killer was not alone but traveled at the center of a fleet formation that incorporated vessels from dozens of different technological traditions, creating an armada that represented the accumulated military might of every chaos faction that had ever emerged from the Eye of Terror. The Blackstone fortresses accompanying Abaddon's flagship demonstrated power levels that rendered Imperial strategic calculations meaningless. These ancient constructs, each the size of a small moon, generated energy signatures that exceeded the total output of entire Forge worlds while simultaneously creating gravitational anomalies that affected stellar mechanics across multiple star systems. Imperial astrophysicists monitoring the approaching fleet reported that the very presence of the Blackstone fortresses was causing measurable changes in the orbit of Cadia itself. Fleet engagements between Imperial Navy forces and the advancing Chaos Armada revealed the inadequacy of 10,000 years of Imperial naval doctrine when confronted with enemies that could manipulate reality as a tactical weapon. The first major confrontation occurred when Battle Group Solar, comprising 12 Imperial battleships and their escort squadrons, attempted to establish a defensive perimeter at the system's outer gravitational boundary. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fist's battle barge Fist of Dorn transmitted real-time tactical reports that documented the systematic destruction of Imperial naval doctrine as a viable military strategy. Chaos vessels employed weapons that ignored void shields entirely, striking directly at the hull structure of Imperial ships through means that Imperial sensors could not detect or classify. More disturbing were reports of Imperial vessels being destroyed by their own weapons, as chaos influence corrupted machine spirits and turned Imperial firepower against itself. The planet killer's primary weapon system, revealed during its engagement with Acadian orbital defense platforms, operated through principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of matter and energy. Rather than destroying targets through conventional application of force, the weapon appeared to convince reality that the targeted objects had never existed. Imperial vessels simply vanished from all sensor readings without producing debris fields or energy signatures, leaving empty space where moments before there had been ships containing thousands of Imperial personnel. Space Marine battle barges attempting ramming attacks against Blackstone fortresses discovered that conventional boarding tactics were useless against structures that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Assault squads that successfully breached the hulls of these massive constructs found themselves in corridors that extended infinitely in all directions, while teleportarium attacks resulted in strike forces appearing inside solid bulkheads or materializing in vacuum where internal spaces should have existed. The Cadian defense platforms, massive orbital installations that had protected the system for millennia, attempted to coordinate resistance using targeting systems designed for conventional void warfare. Their macro cannons and lance batteries, capable of destroying entire squadrons of enemy vessels under normal circumstances, proved ineffective against targets that could alter their physical properties in response to incoming fire. Shells that should have penetrated armor instead passed harmlessly through hulls that temporarily adopted the consistency of vapor, while energy beams were absorbed by surfaces that converted destructive force into power for enemy weapon systems. Imperial Navy crews reported equipment malfunctions that suggested chaos influence could corrupt Imperial technology across interstellar distances without direct contact. Ships that had never been in the same system as chaos forces found their navigation systems providing false readings, their communication arrays broadcasting messages that had never been sent, and their weapon targeting systems acquiring locks on Imperial vessels instead of enemy targets. The corruption spread through Imperial fleets faster than any conventional infection, suggesting transmission methods that operated through principles unknown to Imperial science. The authorization of increasingly desperate measures by Imperial High Command revealed the extent to which traditional military hierarchy was breaking down under impossible pressure. Lord Commander Solar Macharius authorized the deployment of exterminatus weapons against Imperial worlds that showed signs of chaos corruption, abandoning 10,000 years of doctrine that prioritized the preservation of human life above all other considerations. Entire sectors were declared expendable if their sacrifice could delay chaos advances, while strategic reserve formations were committed to suicidal holding actions designed to buy time rather than achieve victory. Tech Marines throughout the Imperial fleet began attempting to jury-rig Pylon technology onto Imperial vessels, creating hybrid systems that combined human engineering with alien science in ways that violated core Adeptus Mechanicus principles. These experiments produced ships with unprecedented capabilities, but also created vulnerabilities that Chaos forces learned to exploit with ruthless efficiency. Imperial vessels equipped with modified Pylon technology found themselves more resistant to reality warping attacks, but also more susceptible to conventional weapons as their defensive systems became unpredictable. The deployment of weapons from sealed inquisitorial vaults, technologies that had been forbidden since the Horus Heresy, demonstrated the desperation of Imperial forces facing extinction. These archaeotech devices, whose operational principles were no longer fully understood, proved effective against Chaos forces, but also created side effects that endangered Imperial personnel. Weapons that could banish daemons back to the warp also created temporary rifts in reality that allowed other hostile entities to emerge into real space. Space Marine chapters abandoned centuries of tactical doctrine in favor of desperate innovations that maximize damage output while disregarding traditional concepts of strategic withdrawal and force preservation. Companies that had fought together for decades were divided into individual squads and deployed as suicide units, their missions designed to inflict maximum casualties on Chaos forces regardless of survival probability. The psychological impact of these decisions created morale problems throughout the Imperial military, as even the legendary Space Marines appeared to have abandoned hope of ultimate victory. The corruption of reality that preceded major Chaos fleet movements began affecting Imperial personnel even when they were not in direct combat. Imperial Navy crews reported nightmares that were shared between individuals who had never met, while ship's officers discovered that their memories of previous battles contained details of events that had not yet occurred. Time itself became unreliable as Chaos influence spread, with some Imperial vessels experiencing hours that lasted days while others found their crews aging years during routine patrol missions. Emergency protocols developed during the Horus Heresy for defending against traitor Space Marines proved inadequate when applied to enemies who could alter the physical properties of their weapons and armor through force of will. Imperial Guard regiments, equipped with specialized anti-Astartes equipment, discovered that their weapons were ineffective against Chaos Space Marines who could become intangible at will, or whose armor had been fused with demonic entities that provided protection beyond anything achievable through conventional metallurgy. The realization that Imperial forces were not fighting a conventional military campaign, but attempting to resist cosmic transformation spread throughout the fleet, as reports accumulated of battles where victory and defeat became meaningless concepts. Chaos forces that had been destroyed in combat reappeared at full strength hours later, while Imperial victories resulted in the corruption of the very space where battles had been fought. The battlefield itself had become the primary weapon, and Imperial forces found themselves fighting not just for territorial control but for the right to exist in a universe governed by recognizable physical laws. The cumulative psychological impact of these impossible conditions created a form of combat stress that exceeded anything in Imperial military medicine. Imperial personnel began experiencing reality dissociation symptoms, unable to trust their own perceptions of events around them. Medical officers reported cases of soldiers who had forgotten their own names while retaining perfect memory of tactical procedures, suggesting that Chaos influence could selectively corrupt human consciousness while leaving military training intact. The systematic failure of conventional Imperial military doctrine forced commanders throughout the Cadian system to abandon 10,000 years of established tactical principles in favor of experimental approaches that violated core Imperial beliefs about technology, warfare, and the proper relationship between human forces and alien artifacts. These desperate innovations, born from the recognition that traditional methods were not merely inadequate, but actively counterproductive against reality-warping enemies, represented a fundamental transformation in Imperial military philosophy that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Tech priests attached to the Cadian defense forces began conducting experiments with pylon technology that directly contradicted Adeptus Mechanicus doctrine regarding the handling of xenotech artifacts. Magos Biologus Call, despite explicit prohibitions from Mars, authorized direct neural interface connections between Imperial personnel and pylon control systems, attempting to achieve the level of integration necessary to fully activate the ancient structure's defensive capabilities. These experiments resulted in unprecedented access to pylon operational systems, but also caused permanent psychological changes in the human subjects who survived the interface process. The neural interface experiments revealed that the pylons operated according to principles that required conscious guidance from sentient beings capable of understanding multidimensional mathematical concepts that exceeded normal human cognitive capacity. Imperial volunteers who underwent the enhancement procedures necessary to operate pylon systems effectively found their consciousness expanded beyond human norms, gaining awareness of cosmic forces and galactic-scale phenomena that drove many subjects to madness within hours of successful connection. Tech Marines throughout the Imperial fleet attempted to merge Imperial technology with pylon energy matrices, creating hybrid systems that combined human engineering principles with alien science in ways that produced results exceeding the capabilities of either technology individually. Imperial vessels equipped with pylon-enhanced void shields could survive direct hits from planet-killer weapon systems, while ships mounting pylon-modified weapons could affect chaos vessels that were partially phased out of normal reality. These technological hybridization efforts produced side effects that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of Imperial technology and its relationship to human operators. Machine spirits and pylon-enhanced equipment began exhibiting consciousness levels that approached full artificial intelligence, while some hybrid systems developed the ability to modify their own operational parameters without human input. Most disturbing were reports of Imperial equipment that had begun communicating directly with similar systems on other vessels, suggesting the emergence of a distributed machine consciousness that spanned multiple ships. Imperial Navy vessels began experimenting with controlled warp immersion techniques that allowed them to partially exist in the immaterium while retaining enough connection to real space to engage chaos forces effectively. These experiments, conducted by navigator houses with centuries of warp travel experience, created ships that could phase in and out of reality at will, making them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons while allowing them to strike chaos vessels that were using similar techniques. The controlled warp immersion experiments produced Imperial vessels with capabilities that exceeded anything in recorded naval history but also created crews that were no longer entirely human. Prolonged exposure to warp energies caused mutations that enhanced psychic abilities while gradually eroding normal human psychological patterns. Ships' crews began exhibiting collective consciousness phenomena, while individual crew members developed the ability to perceive events occurring in other star systems simultaneously. Space Marine chapters authorized the use of chaos weapons captured from defeated enemies, modifying corrupted equipment through ritual purification and technological analysis, to create hybrid systems that retained their enhanced capabilities while removing their daemonic influences. These weapons proved devastatingly effective against chaos forces but also created spiritual contamination risks that required constant monitoring by chapter chaplains and librarians. The use of purified chaos weapons revealed tactical advantages that had been unavailable to Imperial forces since the Horus Heresy, including the ability to permanently destroy daemons rather than merely banishing them back to the warp. However, Space Marines equipped with these weapons began experiencing visions and psychological effects that suggested the purification process was incomplete, with some battle brothers reporting dreams in which they fought alongside the original Chaos owners of their weapons. Imperial commanders throughout the system began authorizing cooperation with alien forces that had previously been considered implacable enemies of humanity. Elder Forseers who approached Imperial positions under flags of truce were granted audiences with high-ranking Imperial officers, leading to tactical alliances that would have resulted in immediate inquisitorial intervention under normal circumstances. These temporary alliances provided Imperial forces with intelligence about chaos capabilities and vulnerabilities that proved crucial in developing effective countermeasures. The cooperation with alien forces revealed that the threat posed by the 13th Black Crusade exceeded the normal boundaries of species rivalry, creating conditions where traditional enemies recognized their mutual interest in preventing cosmic transformation that would affect all forms of life in the galaxy. Eldar forces provided Imperial commanders with strategic intelligence about Chaos fleet movements while receiving Imperial support for their own operations against specific Chaos targets. Librarians throughout the Imperial fleet began pushing their psychic abilities beyond established safe limits, accepting permanent psychological damage in exchange for the enhanced capabilities necessary to counter Chaos sorcery on its own terms. These experiments in controlled psychic overexertion created Imperial psychers with power levels that approached those of Daemon princes, but also resulted in burnout rates that exceeded replacement capacity by enormous margins. The psychic enhancement experiments produced Imperial forces capable of engaging Chaos sorcerers in direct metaphysical combat, but also created individuals whose connection to human psychology became increasingly tenuous. Enhanced librarians reported experiencing memories that belonged to other people, while some developed the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously through psychic projection techniques that split their consciousness across vast distances. Imperial Guard regiments began incorporating recovered Chaos cultist equipment into their standard loadouts, using corrupted Vox systems and modified weapons that had been purified through extensive ritual cleansing. These hybrid equipment loadouts provided enhanced capabilities against Chaos forces, but also created risks of residual corruption that required constant vigilance from regimental commissars and attached ecclesiarchy personnel. The systematic violation of Imperial doctrine regarding the handling of corrupted materials created military units with unprecedented effectiveness against Chaos forces, but also established precedents that would have long-term implications for Imperial military culture. Guard regiments that had successfully employed purified Chaos equipment began questioning other Imperial prohibitions, leading to disciplinary problems that spread throughout the planetary defense forces. Attempts to reverse engineer Blackstone Fortress technology in real time during active combat operations produced Imperial weapons platforms with reality manipulation capabilities, but also created systems that required continuous human sacrifice to maintain operational status. These weapons could affect Chaos vessels that were completely phased into the warp but demanded blood offerings that decimated the crews operating them within days of activation. The development of reality manipulation weapons represented the most extreme violation of Imperial technological doctrine since the Age of Strife, creating devices that operated according to principles that challenged the fundamental Imperial belief in the supremacy of human understanding over alien science. Imperial forces found themselves wielding weapons whose operational requirements were as morally corrupting as anything employed by Chaos forces, raising questions about the ultimate cost of victory that few commanders were willing to address. The decision to fully activate all pylons simultaneously, despite unknown consequences, represented the point of no return for Imperial forces on Cadia, committing them to a course of action that would fundamentally alter the nature of the planet, regardless of the battle's outcome. Imperial commanders recognized that full pylon activation would either save Cadia by creating an impenetrable barrier against Chaos forces, or destroy it through energies that exceeded the planet's capacity to contain them. The full pylon activation process required the sacrifice of thousands of Imperial personnel who volunteered to serve as living conduits for energies that would kill them within minutes of system activation. These volunteers, drawn from every branch of Imperial service on Cadia, underwent psychological preparation that emphasized their role as martyrs whose deaths would save the galaxy from cosmic transformation. The activation process itself created reality distortions that made it impossible to determine whether the volunteers had died from energy exposure or had been transformed into something beyond human recognition. The cumulative effect of these desperate innovations was to create Imperial forces that bore little resemblance to the military traditions that had sustained the Imperium for 10 millennia. Imperial commanders found themselves leading armies that employed alien technology, wielded corrupted weapons, and operated according to tactical principles that would have been considered heretical under normal circumstances. The recognition that victory against Chaos forces required the abandonment of core Imperial values created moral crises that affected every level of the military hierarchy, as personnel struggled to maintain their humanity, while employing methods that challenged their fundamental beliefs about the nature of righteous warfare. The revelation of Trazyn the Infinite's true role in Cadia's defense emerged through circumstances that challenged every assumption Imperial commanders had made about their alien allies, and the nature of the battle they were fighting. The ancient Necron overlord had positioned himself not as a temporary ally against a common threat, but as the orchestrator of events that would determine the ultimate fate of both Cadia and the galaxy itself, pursuing objectives that transcended the immediate tactical situation in ways that Imperial minds could barely comprehend. Trajan's collection of Imperial heroes, preserved in stasis for millennia within his Tomb World galleries, was revealed to contain not just historical figures but strategic assets that he had been gathering across 10,000 years of Imperial history. Lord Castellan Creed's disappearance during the height of battle was not a casualty of war, but a calculated acquisition, as Trajan added the greatest tactical mind of the age to his collection, while simultaneously releasing other preserved commanders to continue the fight according to his predetermined strategy. The Necron's intervention in the battle followed patterns that suggested he had been manipulating events on Cadia for far longer than any Imperial authority had suspected. Archaeological evidence uncovered during the height of the siege revealed Necron technology integrated into Cadia's deepest foundational structures, suggesting that the planet's defensive capabilities had always been partially dependent on systems that operated according to Necron rather than Imperial principles. The discovery that some Imperial commanders had been influenced by Necron programming through exposure to ancient technologies created a crisis of trust within the Cadian command structure that proved as devastating as any direct chaos assault. Officers who had served faithfully for decades found their orders questioned by subordinates who could no longer distinguish between legitimate tactical decisions and actions influenced by alien manipulation. Internal conflicts within the Imperial command structure reached critical levels as evidence accumulated that different branches of Imperial service had been working toward contradictory objectives without realizing the extent of their conflicting priorities. The Imperial Navy focused on void superiority and fleet preservation, while Imperial Guard commanders prioritized ground-based defensive positions that required naval support the fleet could not provide without compromising its own survival. Space Marine chapters operating on Cadia discovered that their independent command structures had led them to pursue tactical objectives that undermined other Imperial forces' strategic plans. The Ultramarines' emphasis on civilian evacuation conflicted with the Imperial Guard's need for every available position to be defended, while the Imperial Fist's focus on fortress construction consumed resources that other chapters required for offensive operations against Chaos strongholds. The spreading corruption through Imperial communication networks revealed itself to be far more systematic and long-term than initially suspected. Chaos influence had infiltrated not just individual Vox transmissions, but the fundamental protocols that governed how Imperial forces shared tactical information. Officers receiving orders found that the same commands contained different instructions when viewed by different personnel, creating coordination failures that appeared to be the result of incompetence but were actually evidence of sophisticated corruption of Imperial information systems. Tech priests investigating communication failures discovered that machine spirits throughout the Imperial network had been gradually corrupted over periods spanning decades, suggesting that Chaos forces had been preparing for the 13th Black Crusade far longer than Imperial intelligence had realized. The corruption was not random but followed specific patterns designed to create maximum confusion during critical tactical situations while remaining undetectable during routine operations. Imperial Guard regiments began experiencing internal conflicts as soldiers discovered that their officers were issuing orders that directly contradicted established Imperial doctrine. Commissars attempting to maintain discipline found themselves unable to determine which orders represented legitimate Imperial authority and which had been corrupted by Chaos influence, leading to summary executions of officers who may have been following genuine Imperial commands. The realization that Chaos cults had infiltrated the highest levels of Cadian military command created paranoia that spread faster than any physical corruption. Officers who had worked together for years began suspecting each other of treachery, while enlisted personnel found themselves unable to trust the chain of command that had been the foundation of Imperial military effectiveness for millennia. Astropathic communications carrying false guidance to military commanders were revealed to be not random corruption but carefully crafted misinformation designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Imperial tactical doctrine. Chaos forces had studied Imperial military procedures with such thoroughness that they could predict how Imperial commanders would respond to particular types of intelligence, allowing them to manipulate Imperial forces into disadvantageous positions through the provision of seemingly helpful but ultimately destructive information. The discovery that some Imperial victories had actually advanced Chaos strategic objectives created a crisis of confidence that affected every level of the military hierarchy. Battles that Imperial forces had celebrated as successful defensive actions were revealed to have been conducted exactly as Chaos forces had intended, with Imperial tactical successes serving to position Imperial forces for subsequent defeats that would be far more devastating than the initial losses would have been. Imperial reinforcements arriving at Cadia were found to have been corrupted during their journey through warp space, bringing with them Chaos influence that manifested only after they had been integrated into defensive positions. These corrupted reinforcements appeared to function normally until critical moments when their true loyalties were revealed, causing defensive lines to collapse from within just as external Chaos assaults reached maximum intensity. The Imperial tarot readings that had guided strategic planning throughout the campaign were discovered to have been systematically manipulated through psychic interference that operated below the threshold of detection by even experienced Imperial diviners. The cards had provided guidance that seemed consistent with Imperial interests but actually served to position Imperial forces according to Chaos strategic requirements. Tech adepts monitoring Pylon operations discovered that their own modifications to the ancient systems had been unconsciously guided by alien influences that had been affecting Imperial technical personnel for centuries. The improvements they had made to Pylon technology had actually prepared the systems for catastrophic overload, ensuring that the Pylons would destroy themselves when pushed beyond normal operational parameters. The recognition that multiple factions had been planning for Cadia's destruction as a necessary step in larger strategic plans revealed the true scope of the manipulation that Imperial forces had been subjected to. Chaos forces, Necron influences, and even some Imperial authorities had been working toward the same objective through different methods, creating a convergence of interests that made Cadia's fall inevitable regardless of the tactical outcome of individual battles. Imperial High Command's realization that the battle had never been about saving Cadia, but about controlling the manner of its destruction created moral crises throughout the command structure. Officers who had sacrificed thousands of personnel to defend positions that were always intended to be abandoned found themselves questioning the fundamental principles of Imperial military service and their own role in events that they had never fully understood. The evidence that the Pylons' true purpose required the planet's sacrifice revealed that Cadia's 10,000-year role as humanity's greatest fortress had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the planet's strategic importance. The world had never been humanity's shield against chaos, but rather a carefully prepared staging ground for cosmic transformation that would affect the entire galaxy regardless of which faction claimed ultimate victory in the immediate tactical situation. The discovery that traditional concepts of loyalty and betrayal were inadequate for understanding cosmic-scale conflicts created philosophical crises that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. Imperial personnel found themselves forced to reconceptualize their understanding of duty, honor, and service when faced with evidence that their most fundamental beliefs about the nature of their mission had been based on incomplete information and deliberate deception by forces whose true motivations remained incomprehensible to human understanding. The infrastructure breakdown that swept across Cadia as the battle reached its climax represented far more than conventional battle damage or system overload, manifesting instead as a systematic unraveling of the technological and organizational structures that had maintained planetary civilization for 10 millennia. The collapse followed patterns that suggested not random destruction but the activation of long-dormant failure modes that had been built into Cadia's foundational systems from the moment of their original construction. The Cadian orbital platforms, massive installations that had protected the planet from void-based threats since the early days of Imperial expansion, began losing power in cascade patterns that affected multiple stations simultaneously. These failures could not be attributed to battle damage, as many platforms experiencing total system shutdown had not been engaged by enemy forces and showed no signs of external interference. Tech adepts investigating the failures discovered that critical components were aging at accelerated rates, with some systems showing centuries of wear accumulated over periods of mere hours. The underground bunker complexes that honeycombed Cadia's crust, designed to shelter the planet's population during orbital bombardment, began flooding as geotectonic activity increased beyond anything in recorded geological history. The flooding was not caused by conventional water sources, but by liquids that appeared spontaneously within sealed chambers, suggesting that matter itself was being created or transformed through processes that violated fundamental physical principles. Transportation networks that had moved personnel and supplies across Cadia's surface for millennia became unusable as reality distortions made linear travel impossible between many locations. Imperial Guard units attempting to redeploy between defensive positions found that routes which should have taken hours instead required days, while some attempted journeys resulted in units arriving at their destinations before they had departed their original positions. Communication arrays throughout the planetary defense network began broadcasting only static mixed with voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Imperial communications specialists attempting to restore normal function discovered that their equipment was receiving transmissions from sources that did not appear on any scanner readings, while attempts to block these mysterious signals resulted in complete communication failures that left Imperial forces unable to coordinate their defensive efforts. The atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air across Cadia's industrial centers began producing toxic clouds that were lethal to human life, while simultaneously creating environments that seemed to sustain forms of life that had never been documented in Imperial biological surveys. Imperial personnel attempting to maintain these critical systems found that standard maintenance procedures were causing equipment failures rather than preventing them, suggesting that the machinery was evolving according to principles that made normal technical support counterproductive. Life support systems in underground military complexes began failing in patterns that created environmental conditions suitable for entities that existed partially in the warp rather than normal human occupants. Imperial forces retreating to supposedly secure bunkers discovered that the air itself had become hostile to human physiology, while temperature and humidity controls created microclimates that seemed designed to support non-human forms of existence. Automated defense systems throughout the planetary network began targeting Imperial forces with the same precision and determination they had previously applied to Chaos invaders. These systems could not be shut down through normal command protocols, as they had developed the ability to modify their own programming in real time to counter any attempt at external control. Imperial forces found themselves fighting two separate wars simultaneously, one against external Chaos forces and another against their own defensive infrastructure. The retreat from strategic positions that had been held continuously for thousands of years created psychological trauma that affected Imperial morale as severely as any physical defeat. Fortress monasteries that had served as symbols of Imperial permanence were abandoned by their defenders not because of enemy action, but because the structures themselves had become uninhabitable for human occupants. Ancient shrines and holy sites sacred to Imperial religious tradition were left to Chaos forces, not through military necessity, but because the locations had developed psychic properties that were hostile to Imperial spiritual practices. Chaplains attempting to conduct religious services in these traditionally sacred spaces found that their prayers were being answered by entities that were decidedly not the Emperor, while religious artifacts began manifesting properties that challenged core Imperial theological assumptions. Imperial Guard regiments faced with increasingly suicidal orders began experiencing command structure breakdown, as soldiers questioned whether their officers were still acting in Imperial interests or had been corrupted by exposure to reality-distorting influences. Commissars attempting to maintain discipline found themselves unable to distinguish between legitimate tactical decisions and orders that had been influenced by alien or Chaos corruption. Space Marine chapters discovered that their traditional emphasis on preserving sacred relics and chapter artifacts was creating tactical disadvantages when these priorities conflicted with immediate military necessities. Companies that had fought together for decades found themselves divided as different combat squads pursued contradictory objectives based on their interpretation of which assets were most crucial to preserve for future generations. Naval commanders operating in increasingly unstable void conditions began making independent strategic decisions based on their assessment of local tactical situations rather than following coordinated fleet-wide strategies. The breakdown of unified command structures created opportunities for individual ship captains to pursue tactical innovations that proved locally successful but undermined overall strategic coordination. Tech priests faced with equipment that no longer functioned according to established technical principles began abandoning standard maintenance protocols in favor of experimental approaches that violated core Adeptus Mechanicus doctrine. These improvisational repair techniques often restored functionality to critical systems, but also created dependencies on maintenance procedures that could not be replicated by personnel who had not undergone the same experimental learning process. Emergency protocols designed to preserve Imperial personnel and equipment during strategic withdrawal proved inadequate when applied to conditions where the basic assumptions underlying Imperial military doctrine were no longer valid. Evacuation procedures that had been developed for conventional warfare created additional vulnerabilities when employed against enemies who could manipulate reality to make retreat routes more dangerous than remaining in combat positions. The fighting retreat through compromised defensive positions required Imperial forces to abandon strategic assets that had been accumulated over centuries of preparation, creating resource shortages that affected not just immediate tactical capabilities, but long-term strategic options for continuing resistance. Imperial commanders found themselves forced to choose between preserving personnel and preserving equipment, with either choice creating disadvantages that would affect future military operations. Heroic rearguard actions designed to buy time for civilian evacuation and strategic asset preservation became increasingly meaningless, as time itself became unreliable in areas of heavy chaos influence. Imperial forces conducting delaying actions discovered that their sacrifices were not providing the expected tactical advantages, because the temporal distortions created by reality manipulation made it impossible to predict how much time their resistance was actually purchasing. The psychological impact of fighting a retreat through terrain that had been transformed beyond recognition affected Imperial personnel in ways that conventional military psychiatry could not address. Soldiers found themselves defending positions that no longer existed in any meaningful sense while retreating through landscapes that changed appearance depending on the observer's perspective and emotional state. The cumulative effect of these cascading failures was to create military conditions that exceeded the worst-case scenarios that Imperial strategic planners had developed during 10 millennia of contingency preparation. Imperial forces found themselves operating in an environment where their own infrastructure had become actively hostile while their enemies demonstrated the ability to transform the battlefield itself into a weapon that rendered traditional military capabilities irrelevant to the ultimate outcome of the engagement. The recognition that the collapse was following predetermined patterns, rather than resulting from immediate battle damage, forced Imperial commanders to confront the possibility that Cadia's fall had been inevitable from the moment the battle began, with all their tactical decisions serving merely to determine the specific manner in which the planet's defenses would be overwhelmed by forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional military science. The siege of Khazar Kraf and the remaining Cadian strongholds represented the convergence of 10,000 years of military preparation, cosmic manipulation, and strategic planning into a final confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of a single world, but the fundamental structure of reality throughout the galaxy. The battle that unfolded around Cadia's last functioning pylon complexes transcended conventional warfare, becoming instead a contest between different concepts of existence itself. Abaddon the Despoiler's personal participation in the final ground assault marked the first time in Imperial history that a Chaos War Master had committed himself to direct combat on such a scale, leading formations of Chaos Space Marines whose individual capabilities exceeded those of entire Imperial Guard regiments. The War Master's presence on the battlefield created reality distortions that extended for kilometers around his position, transforming the very ground his forces traversed into terrain that operated according to chaos rather than Imperial principles. The Black Legion forces accompanying Abaddon represented the culmination of 10 millennia of chaos military evolution, incorporating warriors from every previous Black Crusade who had been granted immortality through warp corruption while retaining their accumulated combat experience. These veterans fought with tactical knowledge that spanned the entire history of Imperial chaos conflict, employing strategies that had been refined through centuries of warfare against every type of Imperial defensive doctrine. Imperial forces consolidating around the last operational pylon complexes found themselves defending positions that were simultaneously the most important strategic objectives on the planet and the most dangerous locations for human occupancy. The pylons' increased energy output created environmental conditions that were hostile to human physiology while providing protection against chaos influence, forcing Imperial defenders to choose between safety and effectiveness. Lord Castellan Creed's final tactical innovations, implemented during the battle's most critical phase, demonstrated the highest levels of Imperial strategic thinking applied to impossible circumstances. His coordination of disparate Imperial forces, Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Planetary Defense Forces, and even civilian volunteers, created a unified defensive effort that maximized every available resource, while acknowledging that ultimate victory was mathematically impossible given the disparity in forces and capabilities. The defense of the Pylon installations required Imperial forces to fight simultaneously against Chaos ground forces and the effects of the ancient structures themselves, as increased energy output began affecting Imperial equipment in ways that created as many tactical disadvantages as advantages. Imperial weapons enhanced by Pylon energy could affect Chaos forces that were partially phased into the warp, but the same energy fields caused conventional Imperial equipment to malfunction in patterns that suggested the technology was evolving beyond human understanding. Space Marine companies from multiple chapters coordinated their defense of critical positions through tactical innovations that had never been attempted in Imperial military history. Ultramarines, Imperial Fists and Blood Angels integrated their combat doctrines into unified strategies that maximized the unique capabilities of each chapter while compensating for their individual limitations through mutual support that exceeded anything achieved during the Great Crusade. The battle for control of individual Pylon installations created tactical situations where conventional concepts of victory and defeat became meaningless. Imperial forces could successfully defend Pylon structures from Chaos assault, while simultaneously losing control of the installations, as the ancient devices began operating according to programming that predated human understanding. Victories in combat terms became defeats in strategic terms as secured Pylons continued to function according to alien rather than Imperial objectives. Chaos Space Marines led by Daemon Princes demonstrated combat capabilities that challenged every assumption Imperial forces had developed about the limitations of warp-corrupted enemies. These enhanced warriors fought with coordination that suggested hive mind-level integration while retaining individual initiative and tactical creativity, creating opponents who combined the advantages of unified command with the unpredictability of independent action. The arrival of Daemon hordes summoned through reality tiers created by Pylon overload produced combat conditions that required Imperial forces to fight enemies that existed partially outside normal space-time. Imperial weapons designed for conventional warfare proved inconsistently effective against opponents whose physical properties changed according to their emotional states and tactical requirements rather than fixed biological or technological parameters. The Planet Killer's final positioning for the decisive bombardment created gravitational effects that altered the fundamental structure of the Cadian system, making it impossible for Imperial reinforcements to reach the planet while simultaneously preventing Chaos forces from withdrawing, even if they had desired to do so. The massive vessel's presence locked all combatants into a final confrontation where retreat was physically impossible for any faction involved in the battle. Imperial Navy vessels attempting to provide orbital fire support discovered that their weapons were as likely to harm Imperial ground forces as Chaos enemies due to reality distortions that made targeting calculations unreliable. Naval gunfire that should have struck Chaos positions instead materialized within Imperial defensive lines, while support intended for Imperial forces appeared in areas that had been evacuated hours earlier. The moment of Pylon overload created a cascade failure that transformed the nature of the battle from military conflict into cosmic catastrophe. The ancient structures, pushed beyond their design parameters by both Imperial modifications and Chaos interference, began releasing energies that had been contained for millions of years. The resulting explosion of power created reality distortions that affected the fundamental structure of space-time throughout the Cadian system. Imperial forces in the immediate vicinity of overloading Pylons experienced temporal displacement that removed them from the battle without traditional death or evacuation. Personnel who had been fighting at specific locations simply ceased to exist in normal space-time, though whether they had been destroyed or transported to alternative realities remained impossible to determine given the breakdown of conventional observational methods. The Planet Killer's final bombardment, delivered at the moment of maximum Pylon instability, represented the convergence of Chaos strategic planning with cosmic forces that exceeded even Abaddon's ability to fully control. The vessel's reality warping weapons interacted with Pylon energy fields to create effects that surpassed the destructive capability of either technology individually, producing the galaxy-spanning catastrophe that would become known as the Great Rift. Cadia's physical destruction occurred not through conventional planetary bombardment, but through the fundamental alteration of the relationship between matter and energy within the planet's gravitational field. The world did not explode in traditional terms, but instead underwent transformation into a state where normal physical properties no longer applied, creating a region of space where the distinction between solid matter and warp energy became meaningless. The atmospheric ignition that preceded the planet's final transformation created a phenomenon visible throughout the Cadian system. As oxygen-based combustion interacted with warp energies to produce fires that burned with colors that had no names in human language, the resulting conflagration consumed not just the planet's atmosphere, but the very concept of atmosphere, creating environmental conditions that challenged the possibility of conventional life existing anywhere within the system. Imperial evacuation fleets attempting to escape through rapidly closing warp routes found their retreat complicated by temporal distortions that made it impossible to determine whether their escape attempts were occurring before or after the planet's destruction. Some vessels reported successful evacuation from a planet that scanners indicated had already been destroyed, while others found themselves fleeing from a world that appeared intact despite their knowledge that its destruction was imminent. Chaos forces that had achieved tactical victory found themselves unable to fully exploit their success as their own reality manipulation capabilities began operating beyond their control. The victory they had sought transformed into a catastrophe that affected Chaos forces as severely as Imperial defenders, creating conditions where traditional concepts of winner and loser became irrelevant to the actual consequences of the engagement. The birth cry of the Great Rift, emerging from the convergence of pylon energy, planet-killer bombardment and warp instability, created a psychic scream that was perceived by sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy. This cosmic shriek announced not just the fall of Cadia, but the beginning of fundamental changes in the relationship between physical reality and the warp that would affect every living being in the galaxy regardless of their species, faction, or location. The immediate aftermath of Cadia's transformation revealed that the battle's outcome had been predetermined not by the tactical decisions of individual commanders, but by cosmic forces that had been building toward this moment for millions of years. The fall of humanity's greatest fortress world marked not the end of Imperial resistance, but the beginning of a new phase of galactic history where the fundamental assumptions underlying all previous military, political, and philosophical frameworks would require complete reconceptualization to remain relevant to the transformed cosmic environment. The Great Rift's opening created an immediate crisis of understanding that affected every Imperial institution simultaneously, as reports reached different sectors of the galaxy describing phenomena that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying 10,000 years of Imperial civilization. The massive tear in reality that now bisected the galaxy created conditions where traditional Imperial administrative, military, and religious structures found themselves operating in an environment for which no amount of preparation could have been adequate. Imperial forces scattered on both sides of the newly formed Cicatrix Maledictum faced the immediate challenge of maintaining operational effectiveness, while cut off from the command structures that had coordinated their activities for millennia. Space Marine chapters found themselves isolated from their parent organizations, while Imperial Guard regiments discovered that the reinforcement and supply networks they depended upon no longer existed in any functional sense. Communication breakdown between Terra and the newly designated Dark Imperium created administrative chaos that exceeded even the disruptions caused by major warp storms. Astropathic messages that had previously taken days to transmit across sectors now failed to reach their destinations entirely, while those communications that did succeed often arrived so garbled by warp interference that their content was worse than useless for coordination purposes. Individual Imperial sectors, forced to become self-sufficient overnight, faced challenges that their administrative structures had never been designed to handle. Worlds that had specialized in single-resource production for millennia suddenly needed to develop comprehensive manufacturing capabilities, while sectors that had relied on imported food supplies found themselves facing starvation within months of the rift's opening. The power vacuum created by the loss of centralized Imperial authority manifested differently across various regions of the galaxy, with some areas developing functional local governments, while others descended into anarchy or fell under the control of opportunistic warlords. The diversity of responses to Imperial fragmentation revealed the extent to which different regions had developed distinct cultural and political characteristics, despite their theoretical unity under imperial rule. Imperial commanders throughout the galaxy found themselves receiving contradictory orders from multiple sources, claiming imperial authority, creating situations where loyal imperial servants were forced to choose between competing interpretations of their duty. The absence of clear command hierarchy led to conflicts between different imperial factions that consumed resources desperately needed for defense against external threats. Time distortions throughout rift-affected regions made it impossible to coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple star systems, as the concept of simultaneity itself became meaningless when different locations experienced temporal flow at dramatically different rates. Imperial forces attempting to execute coordinated strategies found that their carefully timed operations were occurring in random sequence rather than synchronized patterns. Space Marine chapters responded to isolation by establishing independent recruitment and training protocols that preserved their essential capabilities while adapting to local conditions. These modifications often involved cooperation with planetary governments and local military forces on levels that had been prohibited under normal Imperial doctrine, creating hybrid organizations that retained Space Marine effectiveness while incorporating elements of local military traditions. Imperial Guard regiments stranded far from their homeworlds began recruiting locally to maintain unit strength, leading to the development of military formations that combined Imperial training and equipment with local tactical knowledge and cultural practices. These hybrid units often proved more effective than traditional Imperial Guard formations when operating in their specific regional environments, though their loyalty to broader Imperial objectives became increasingly questionable as local concerns took precedence over distant Imperial policy. Forge worlds isolated from Mars began developing independent research programs and manufacturing capabilities that violated traditional Adeptus Mechanicus restrictions on technological innovation. The necessity of maintaining equipment without access to standard template constructs forced tech priests to develop improvisational approaches that combined orthodox Imperial technology with locally available materials and techniques. Imperial Navy squadrons found themselves establishing new patrol routes and base locations based on regional strategic requirements rather than galaxy-wide Imperial policy. Fleet commanders began making independent decisions about which worlds to defend and which to abandon, creating regional variations in Imperial naval doctrine that reflected local conditions rather than universal Imperial strategic principles. The ecclesiarchy faced theological crises, as isolated Imperial worlds developed religious practices that incorporated local spiritual traditions while maintaining nominal loyalty to the Emperor. These syncretic belief systems often proved more effective at maintaining Imperial identity and resistance to chaos corruption than orthodox Imperial doctrine, though they challenged traditional concepts of religious unity and doctrinal purity. Civilian populations throughout the affected regions experienced social upheaval that went far beyond the immediate physical effects of the rift's opening. Communities that had maintained stable social structures for centuries found themselves adapting to conditions where traditional sources of authority were no longer accessible, leading to the development of new forms of social organization that combined Imperial values with practical necessity. Daemon incursions began occurring in Imperial systems that had never previously experienced significant warp-related threats, forcing local defense forces to develop countermeasures against enemies for which they had no training or appropriate equipment. These spontaneous daemon manifestations followed no predictable patterns, making it impossible for Imperial authorities to develop systematic defensive strategies. Warp storms lasting for subjective years created temporal isolation that affected different worlds within the same systems at different rates, leading to situations where planetary governments found themselves unable to coordinate with their own orbital installations or neighboring worlds. The breakdown of local coordination proved as disruptive as the loss of galaxy-wide Imperial unity. Ancient threats that had been contained through constant Imperial vigilance began awakening or escaping as the military forces responsible for their suppression were redeployed to address more immediate crises. Xenos civilizations that had remained hidden during the height of Imperial power began expanding into territories that Imperial forces could no longer patrol effectively. Reality distortions created by the Rift's presence made conventional military tactics unreliable throughout affected regions. Imperial forces found that their weapons and equipment functioned differently depending on their proximity to Rift phenomena. while standard tactical doctrines produced unpredictable results when applied in environments where physical laws operated according to inconsistent principles. Some Imperial worlds discovered that their isolation from the broader Imperium had actually improved their defensive capabilities by forcing them to develop self-reliance and innovation that had been discouraged under traditional Imperial administration. These worlds began serving as regional power centers, providing leadership and coordination for surrounding systems that had lost contact with higher Imperial authority. The psychological impact on Imperial populations of learning that their galaxy had been permanently divided proved as significant as any physical disruption. Imperial citizens who had been raised to believe in the Emperor's dominion over the entire galaxy found themselves forced to reconceptualize their understanding of Imperial power and their own place within a fragmented civilization. Refugee crises created by the displacement of populations from rift-affected worlds strained the resources of stable Imperial systems while creating opportunities for chaos infiltration through the movement of large numbers of people whose backgrounds could not be thoroughly investigated. The traditional Imperial approach of quarantining potentially corrupted populations proved impossible to implement when entire sectors were affected simultaneously. The emergence of new threats and opportunities within Rift-influenced space began attracting exploration and exploitation efforts by various Imperial factions, creating competition for resources and territory that had not previously existed. These internal Imperial conflicts consumed resources that were desperately needed for defense against external threats while creating precedents for Imperial-on-Imperial warfare that had been unthinkable since the Horus Heresy. The cumulative effect of these immediate disruptions was to transform the Imperium from a centralized galactic government into a collection of regional powers that maintained varying degrees of loyalty to Imperial ideals while pursuing increasingly independent policies based on local conditions and requirements. The galaxy that emerged from the immediate aftermath of the Great Rift's opening bore little resemblance to the unified Imperial civilization that had existed before Cadia's fall, setting the stage for fundamental changes in human civilization that would continue to evolve over the subsequent centuries. The technological adaptations that emerged from the necessity of operating in post-Rift conditions fundamentally altered the trajectory of Imperial technological development for the first time since the Age of Strife. Imperial engineers, no longer bound by the restrictive doctrines that had maintained technological stagnation for 10 millennia, began developing innovations that combined traditional Imperial design principles with practical solutions to problems that had never existed in the pre-Rift galaxy. The development of Rift-capable communication technologies represented perhaps the most significant breakthrough in Imperial science since the creation of the Astronomicon itself. These new systems, developed independently by multiple Forge worlds using principles derived from captured alien technology and desperate experimentation, could maintain reliable communication links across Rift-influenced space by employing quantum entanglement principles that bypassed traditional warp-based transmission methods entirely. Modifications to Geller field technology, necessitated by the dramatically increased warp hazards throughout the galaxy, produced defensive systems that were exponentially more effective than their predecessors, while also creating side effects that fundamentally altered the nature of Imperial space travel. Ships equipped with enhanced Geller fields could traverse warp routes that had become impassable to conventional vessels, but their crews experienced psychological changes that suggested prolonged exposure to the improved technology was gradually altering human consciousness in ways that Imperial medical science could not fully understand. Navigation techniques adapted to post-Rift warp conditions created a new generation of navigator houses whose abilities exceeded those of their predecessors, while also requiring genetic modifications that pushed the boundaries of acceptable human mutation. These enhanced navigators could perceive warp currents that were invisible to traditional navigator sight, but their expanded consciousness made them increasingly alien to normal human psychology and social interaction. Weaponry designed specifically to combat reality warping threats incorporated principles that violated core Imperial beliefs about the relationship between human technology and alien science. These hybrid weapon systems combined Imperial manufacturing techniques with operational principles derived from Necron, Eldar, and even Chaos technologies, creating armaments that were devastatingly effective against post-Rift threats while requiring maintenance procedures that challenged traditional Imperial understanding of how technology should function. The cultural shifts that occurred within isolated Imperial communities represented the most fundamental transformation of Imperial civilization since the Age of Apostasy. Imperial worlds that had maintained identical cultural practices for millennia began developing regional variations that reflected their adaptation to local conditions, while preserving core imperial values through modified expression rather than traditional orthodoxy. Military traditions evolved to accommodate the reality that traditional Imperial Guard doctrine was inadequate for fighting enemies who could manipulate the battlefield itself. Regional military forces developed tactical innovations that combined Imperial training with local knowledge and captured alien techniques, creating hybrid fighting forces that were more effective than traditional Imperial units while also being less recognizably Imperial in their methods and organization. Educational systems throughout the affected regions underwent fundamental revision as Imperial worlds recognized that traditional Imperial education, focused on obedience and rote learning, was inadequate for preparing populations to survive in the post-Rift environment. New educational approaches emphasized problem-solving, adaptability, and technical innovation, while maintaining Imperial values through practical application rather than theoretical indoctrination. Religious practices evolved to incorporate local spiritual traditions while maintaining core Imperial theological principles, creating syncretic belief systems that proved more effective at maintaining Imperial identity and resistance to chaos corruption than orthodox Imperial doctrine. These adapted religious practices often demonstrated greater psychological resilience and community cohesion than traditional Imperial faith, suggesting that religious flexibility might be more effective than doctrinal purity for maintaining Imperial civilization under extreme conditions. Art and literature throughout the Dark Imperium began reflecting themes of survival, adaptation, and transformation that had been largely absent from Imperial culture during the millennia of stability and stagnation. These cultural productions served not merely as entertainment, but as psychological tools for helping Imperial populations process the trauma of their changed circumstances, while maintaining hope for eventual reunification with the broader Imperium. The theological debates sparked by the Great Rift's opening challenged fundamental Imperial religious assumptions about the nature of the Emperor's power and the relationship between humanity and the divine. Different Imperial worlds began developing divergent interpretations of Imperial doctrine that reflected their specific experiences with Rift-related phenomena, creating theological diversity that approached heresy while remaining technically orthodox through creative reinterpretation of traditional Imperial religious texts. Border wars along the edges of stable Rift territories created a new category of Imperial conflict that combined traditional military objectives with the necessity of controlling territories where reality itself was contested. These conflicts required tactical approaches that incorporated reality manipulation as both weapon and obstacle, forcing Imperial military doctrine to evolve beyond purely physical concepts of warfare into metaphysical combat that challenged traditional Imperial understanding of what military victory actually meant. Competition for resources between previously cooperative Imperial sectors created internal Imperial conflicts that consumed resources desperately needed for defense against external threats, while establishing precedents for Imperial-on-Imperial warfare that had been unthinkable since the Horus Heresy. These conflicts arose not from traditional political disagreements, but from the fundamental necessity of survival in conditions where Imperial administrative systems could no longer coordinate resource distribution effectively. The development of new Imperial saint cults focused on survival and adaptation reflected the transformation of Imperial religious expression from worship of distant historical figures to veneration of contemporary examples of successful adaptation to post-Rift conditions. These new saints represented virtues that had been less emphasized in traditional Imperial religion: flexibility, innovation, and regional loyalty, while maintaining connection to broader Imperial spiritual traditions. The discovery of Imperial forces that had been trapped in warp storms for subjective centuries provided unexpected insights into alternative methods of Imperial organization and survival. These isolated communities had developed social, military, and technological innovations that proved valuable for other Imperial groups facing similar challenges, creating networks of knowledge exchange that operated independently of traditional Imperial administrative structures. Ancient human colonies that had been cut off by the Rift revealed technologies and social structures that had evolved along different paths from mainstream Imperial civilization. These communities often possessed knowledge and capabilities that had been lost to the broader Imperium during millennia of technological stagnation, providing resources for Imperial reconstruction that came from unexpected sources within humanity's own forgotten history. Hidden Imperial facilities that continued operating with pre-Rift objectives created situations where Imperial personnel found themselves following orders from authorities that no longer existed while pursuing strategic goals that were no longer relevant to current conditions. The resolution of these situations required fundamental reconsideration of concepts like duty, loyalty, and legitimate authority within Imperial culture. The strategic implications of permanent galactic division forced Imperial political philosophy to evolve beyond concepts of universal human dominion toward more nuanced understandings of Imperial identity that could accommodate fragmentation while maintaining core values. This philosophical evolution challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of Imperial civilization while providing frameworks for maintaining Imperial identity under conditions that the original Imperial ideology had never contemplated. The impossibility of coordinated galaxy-wide Imperial strategy necessitated the development of regional strategic doctrines that reflected local conditions, while maintaining compatibility with broader Imperial goals. These regional strategies often proved more effective than traditional Imperial approaches because they incorporated detailed knowledge of local conditions that had been ignored under the previous system of centralized Imperial administration. Changes in how Imperial justice and law were administered reflected the necessity of maintaining Imperial legal principles without access to the bureaucratic structures that had traditionally enforced Imperial law. Local Imperial authorities developed legal innovations that preserved Imperial justice concepts while adapting their application to conditions where traditional Imperial legal procedures were impossible to implement. New forms of Imperial identity emerged from isolation that emphasized regional characteristics while maintaining loyalty to Imperial ideals, creating diversity within Imperial civilization that had been suppressed during the millennia of enforced uniformity. These regional Imperial identities often demonstrated greater resilience and adaptability than traditional Imperial culture while remaining recognizably Imperial in their core values and objectives. The continuing effects of the Great Rift's influence on galactic environmental conditions created long-term changes in stellar formation, planetary development, and the fundamental structure of space-time that affected all forms of life regardless of their political or military affiliations. These cosmic-scale changes established the post-Rift galaxy as fundamentally different from its predecessor, requiring all galactic civilizations to adapt to environmental conditions that had never existed in recorded history. Imperial expeditions launched into the interior of the Great Rift during the years following its formation have returned with discoveries that challenge every assumption Imperial science had developed about the nature of reality, space-time, and the relationship between the physical universe and the warp. The Rift's internal structure, rather than representing simple chaotic destruction, appears to operate according to consistent principles that suggest intelligent design on a scale that exceeds anything achieved by any known galactic civilization. The discovery of stable passages, allowing limited travel across the Great Rift, has created opportunities for reunification between the Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, while also revealing that the Rift itself continues to grow and evolve, according to patterns that suggest it may eventually encompass the entire galaxy. These crossing points, jealously guarded by whatever Imperial forces control them, have become strategic assets of unprecedented importance, while also serving as conduits for influences that affect both sides of the galactic divide. Recent Imperial expeditions have documented new forms of life emerging from Rift-influenced space that appear to represent evolutionary adaptations to environmental conditions that combine aspects of real space and warp existence. These entities, neither fully material nor completely psychic in nature, demonstrate capabilities that exceed those of conventional life forms, while also exhibiting behavioral patterns that suggest intelligence levels approaching or exceeding human standards. The Rift's continuing evolution has created temporal anomalies, where cause and effect operate according to principles that make traditional strategic planning impossible, as actions in the present can influence past events while historical occurrences continue to affect current conditions in ways that violate conventional understanding of temporal mechanics. Imperial forces operating near the Rift report engaging enemies who appear to be fighting battles that occurred centuries ago while simultaneously combating threats that originate from potential futures that may never actually occur. Guilliman's return and the launch of the Indomitus Crusade represent direct responses to the challenges created by the Great Rift. But these initiatives also demonstrate the extent to which post-Rift Imperial civilization differs from its predecessor. The Primarch strategies incorporate tactical flexibility and technological innovation that would have been considered heretical under previous Imperial doctrine, while his willingness to cooperate with alien forces and employ previously forbidden technologies indicates fundamental changes in Imperial strategic philosophy. The development and deployment of Primaris Space Marines reflects Imperial adaptation to post-Rift warfare conditions. But these enhanced warriors also represent a departure from 10,000 years of Space Marine tradition that creates tensions within existing chapter structures. The integration of Primaris Marines into traditional chapters has produced hybrid military organizations that combine the best aspects of both approaches while also creating identity conflicts that affect Space Marine psychology and chapter culture. The Plague Wars and other major post-Rift conflicts have demonstrated that the Great Rift's opening has changed the fundamental nature of chaos incursions, making them more persistent and difficult to eliminate, while also creating opportunities for Imperial forces to exploit the instabilities that affect chaos operations in Rift-influenced space. These conflicts serve as testing grounds for new Imperial military doctrines, while also revealing that traditional concepts of victory and defeat require redefinition when applied to reality-warping warfare. The strategic importance of stable crossing points in the Great Rift has created new forms of warfare focused on controlling territories that exist partially outside normal space-time, requiring military doctrines that incorporate metaphysical considerations alongside traditional tactical concerns. Imperial forces defending these crossing points must simultaneously fight conventional enemies and maintain the stability of reality itself, creating combat situations that exceed the scope of traditional military training. The emergence of the Dark Imperium as a distinct political and cultural entity has created philosophical questions about the nature of Imperial unity and identity that challenge core assumptions about what it means to be Imperial. The development of regional Imperial identities that maintain loyalty to Imperial ideals while adapting to local conditions suggests that Imperial civilization may be evolving toward greater diversity and flexibility than had been possible under the previous system of rigid centralization. Current alien species strategies have been fundamentally altered by the Great Rift's presence, with some civilizations taking advantage of Imperial disorganization to reclaim territories while others have been forced to adapt to cosmic conditions that affect all galactic life regardless of species or faction. The Rift has created opportunities for alien civilizations that had been suppressed during the height of Imperial power while also creating threats that require unprecedented cooperation between traditionally hostile species. The role of the Great Rift in current Tyranid Hive fleet movements remains one of the most significant strategic mysteries facing Imperial intelligence services, as some Hive fleets appear to be avoiding Rift-influenced space, while others seem to be attracted to areas of high warp activity. The possibility that Tyranid Hive minds are capable of adapting to post-Rift conditions raises questions about whether the galaxy's most destructive alien threat may become even more dangerous in the transformed cosmic environment. The relationship between the Great Rift and the awakening Necron dynasties suggests connections between ancient galactic conflicts and current cosmic instabilities that may indicate that the Rift's opening was not a random catastrophe, but part of larger cycles of galactic transformation that operate on timescales exceeding human historical records. Necron responses to the Rift demonstrate capabilities that suggest their technology may be capable of influencing or even controlling cosmic-scale phenomena. The Great Rift's effect on the Emperor's current condition remains one of the most closely guarded secrets within Imperial governance, but fragmentary evidence suggests that the galactic division has affected the Emperor's psychic presence in ways that may be fundamentally altering the nature of Imperial religious experience. Reports of new forms of Imperial miracles and divine intervention suggest that the Emperor's power may be adapting to post-Rift conditions in ways that could transform the relationship between the Emperor and his subjects. Long-term isolation's effects on Imperial identity are beginning to manifest as regional Imperial cultures that maintain core Imperial values while expressing them through local traditions and practices that would have been considered suspicious under previous Imperial doctrine. These cultural adaptations appear to be creating stronger rather than weaker Imperial identities, suggesting that diversity within Imperial civilization may actually strengthen rather than weaken overall Imperial unity. The question of whether the Great Rift can be closed or represents a permanent feature of galactic geography has become central to Imperial strategic planning, with different imperial authorities pursuing contradictory approaches based on their assessment of the rift's nature and purpose. Some imperial leaders view the rift as a wound that must be healed, while others see it as a transformation that imperial civilization must adapt to rather than resist. The true extent of changes yet to be discovered within rift-influenced space continues to expand as imperial exploration efforts reveal phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the relationship between different forms of existence. Each new discovery suggests that the Great Rift's influence extends far beyond simple geographical division to encompass transformations in the basic principles governing life, intelligence, and cosmic structure. The ultimate meaning of the Great Rift within the broader context of Warhammer 40,000's apocalyptic narrative appears to be that even the most catastrophic changes can create opportunities for renewal and adaptation, though the cost of such transformation may exceed anything that previous generations of humanity had been required to pay. The Rift represents both the fulfillment of humanity's darkest fears about cosmic forces beyond their control, and the possibility that such forces may ultimately serve purposes that transcend the immediate suffering they cause. The Great Rift stands as the defining feature of the current age of imperial history, a cosmic phenomenon that embodies all the central themes of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, while also pointing toward possibilities for transformation and renewal that had been absent from imperial civilization for millennia. It represents the ultimate expression of the grim darkness of the far future, while also suggesting that even in the most hopeless circumstances, humanity retains the capacity for adaptation, innovation, and survival. As the galaxy continues to evolve under the influence of forces unleashed during Cadia's fall, the Great Rift serves as both a warning about the consequences of cosmic hubris and a testament to humanity's ability to endure and adapt to conditions that exceed the scope of previous historical experience. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Great Rift represents not an ending but a transformation, and in that transformation lies both ultimate doom and unexpected hope for humanity's continued existence among the stars. The story of the Great Rift continues to unfold across the galaxy, its ultimate implications still unknown, but its immediate effects reshaping every aspect of human civilization in ways that ensure the 41st millennium will be remembered as the age when humanity faced its greatest trial and discovered resources for survival that even they had not known they possessed. In the end, the Great Rift may prove to be not just humanity's greatest catastrophe, but also the catalyst for their greatest triumph over forces that seek to destroy or transform everything that makes them human.